This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager.
This is Brian McMillan's chest. It is large. I mean, batters are not built like this normally, and clearly he was an all-rounder as well. But good enough to average almost 40 in tests. He's just massive. And I'm pointing out this huge chest because one day he was batting in a tour game at the MCG in 93-94 when a wrong-un hit him in this chest. If you were thinking wrong-un, MCG, 1993, the face you were probably thinking of is Shane Warne. He has a statue at that ground. It's his place, and he made leg spin great again. But it wasn't his delivery. The bowler was Craig Howard, a completely different kind of leggy. Howard only played 16 first-class games, and he averaged 40 in them. And if that doesn't sound impressive, then I have bolded a few of the players he dismissed in that short period of time. Ricky Ponting, Jamie Siddons, Michael Bevan, Greg Matthews, Justin Langer, Jonty Rhodes, Brian McMillan, Dean Hills, Jamie Cox, Martin Love, Greg Blewett, Nathan Astle, and Ricky Ponting again. Craig Howard could bowl, and don't just take my word. Warne said that Howard's fast leg spin was actually better than his. But even if that were true, Howard didn't have the body of Warne or the force of personality, and crucially he came after the great man. And while Cricket Australia did everything they could to keep Shane Warne on the field, Howard slipped through the cracks of the last moments of the amateur era of Australian cricket. Without state-of-the-art medical treatment, his body simply could not continue to bowl fast leg spinners, and so he faded away from the Victorian team. Years later, after playing club cricket, he would mount a comeback as a off-spinner. In fact, Howard was the first, and still probably only, player to go through the Australian Academy twice for two completely different disciplines. But sadly, his off-spin wasn't like his incredible leggies, so he ended up playing club cricket in Bendigo. And I would love to say that Howard's story was a one-off, and that the rest of the spinners after Warne had a better time. But Shane Warne's impact was so huge that it seemed to blow away an entire career of other Australian spinners. There was simply no darker place in Australian cricket than in the shadow of Shane Warne. But here's a fun fact for you. There are two Australian cricketers who played for Australia in the 70s, 80s and 90s. The first makes a lot of sense because Allan Border was the grumpy face of Australian cricket. But the other player is far more random. It was a leg spinner named Peter Sleep. And if you don't know who he is, that makes sense. He's just one of many spinners that Australia went through in this period. He was a handy batter with a bit of a weird bowling action who struggled to take consistent wickets at the test level. But even within that, he still hung around for long enough to play his tests over a 12-year period, which gives you an idea of how desperate Australia were for a tweaker. If you have a look at the history of Australian spin, you'll see that it was a fairly normal part of Australian cricket for many years. Richie Benaud, before he was the face of cricket, was a champion leg spinner. Clarry Grimmett was cricket's first 200 wicket taker, and he bowled with Bill O'Reilly, who was probably better but missed a couple of years because of the war, and Hugh Trumbull was the leading wicket taker in the world when he retired in 1904 with his off-spin. That incredible run ends with Benaud. And even after, when Australia get decent spinners, they just don't last that long. Bruce Yardley is an incredibly weird player. He starts as a seam bowler who bats a little bit. A few years into his career, he switches to bowling fast off spin. In 1978, he makes his debut at the age of 31, and he does really well, taking 126 wickets at 31. But in the middle of his international career, he's actually dropped by Western Australia. Then after a few good years in the test team, he retires in his late 30s after a tour of Sri Lanka. But 6 years later, he makes a comeback for Western Australia, where he annoyed people by leaving a club game to go and commentate a test. And then he went back to retirement. Because his peak was so short, and it was during the Kerry Packer years, he's barely mentioned. Ashley Mallett is very interesting because he was really Australia's main spinner in a period where they were moving to pace. There's nothing wrong with his record. He was a very clever bowler, and yet when Kerry Packer picked his original set of World Series stars, he didn't think Mallett was even worth bringing across. But in truth, he was a good bowler, but probably out of time. Those are the only two with a lot of wickets in this period. But Jim Higgs might be the most important one here. His leggies were okay, but in teaching Shane Warne the flipper, he may have done a lot more for Australian cricket. Then you have Ray Bright, who played a lot of matches with his slow left arm, despite not taking that many wickets. You've got Kerry O'Keefe here as well, who's now more well known for telling a frog joke or annoying Indians when talking about the Ranji Trophy. Greg Matthews, who couldn't take any wickets when he bowled for Australia, but weirdly his batting was outstanding. So he made up for his 61 wickets averaging 48 by averaging over 40 with the bat. John Gleeson was a mystery spinner who borrowed his method from Jack Iverson, another weird Aussie mystery spinner. Bob Holland made his test debut at the age of 38, and he played his last first-class season for Wellington. That's quite a few bowlers that we have mentioned here. And the weird thing is, of all those players, only one of them ever took 11 wickets in a test match. And it was one of these two, but it was not Peter Sleep. It was Allan Border, who took 11 wickets against the West Indies, the best team in the world. And the point of all this is to show how far Australian cricket had fallen. Imitations of mystery bowlers, off-spinners unwanted in their own time, old leggies, and their best bowling haul was by someone who took 11 of his career 39 wickets in a single match. Australian spin was in all sorts of trouble coming into the 90s, and Peter Sleep was not the saviour. So it was pretty lucky at this point they found one of the greatest cricketers of all time who just happened to be a spinner as well. But the problem was that when you have one player this good, he actually cast such a shadow out that beneath him it was pretty much as bad as it had been in the 70s and 80s. But in that darkness, there are simply some of the weirdest and most amazing stories in cricket. Stuart MacGill, for instance, was bred to be an Australian cricketer. His father and grandfather were both first-class cricketers. And when his parents gave him the initials SCG, they might as well have told him his future was as an Australian spinner. In fact, to make his career work, he left the Wacker to move to Sydney as his home ground. And while Warne had one of the most amazing careers of all time, Stuart MacGill might have also been the greatest understudy in cricket. 200 wickets at better than 30 was more than Australia could ever have asked for. In some ways, he was almost too similar to play with Warne, a bit like Akshar Patel and Ravi Jadeja. But it worked because they were just different enough. MacGill's main talent was taking the tail, and pairing that with Australia's new ball bowling, and Warne was almost perfect. And a lot of MacGill's good record came from the fact that he bowled with Warne on wickets that spun, meaning he probably looked better than he was at times. But in that role, he was as good as any of the great Indian quartet when they were brought into the side as the extra spinner. MacGill and Warne were very similar in age, so MacGill waited so long to be the main man. And Warne's exit should have meant that he strode onto the scene with his jolly swagger and angry face. And instead, his knee was dodgy and his TV career was gaining momentum. And at one stage, it seemed like Cricket Australia didn't even know where MacGill was. And sadly, when they did, it was because they had followed the trail of long hops. But they persisted with MacGill even when he wasn't bowling as well, and they brought him for the tour of the West Indies. There, he played like a member of the Fanatics who'd been pulled after the crowd after a few drinks. He ran like a man with cardboard knees, and he retired mid-series. He only played 4 tests after Warne, and his average was 65. So less than 18 months after Warne, the replacement was already done. MacGill was never going to be able to replicate Warne, but he was the best facsimile that anyone had ever seen. And all the Australians got were 4 broken tests and a mid-series retirement. And sadly, things have not gone that much better since he left the game. But MacGill wasn't even the only experienced wrist spinner to replace Warne, because Brad Hogg was around at the same time. The white ball specialist had been with the Aussies since his surprise call-up in 2003, which of course again was because of Shane Warne. In fact, because of that suspension and then Warne's retirement, Hogg would win 2 World Cups. But his test history was far more spotty. He made his debut in 1996, which was actually not that long after he'd really started bowling left-arm wrist spin. He then played his 2nd, 3rd and 4th 7 years later when Warne was suspended, and then he disappeared from the red ball game and only was used again in 2008 after Warne's retirement. He struggled a lot in that series and decided afterwards to retire from all international cricket. Being that Warne had quit and Hogg seemed very fit, especially compared to MacGill, it was odd that he left the game at that point. Quitting tests alone would have made a lot more sense. But Hogg was going through a divorce and was struggling with his own mental health, so he made the decision to walk away from all top-level cricket. And at the time, it didn't feel like Australia had lost that much. His batting was nowhere near the level it was when he was young, and no one really expected him to dominate tests. But the weird thing is that 3 years, 9 months and 16 days after his last professional game, he came back to the Big Bash and was so good that he was recalled to the Australian T20 team and also played in the IPL. T20 was clearly his best format by far, as players couldn't pick his wrong and had no time to sit around and milk it. His late career T20 comeback lasted 6 years, and he would retire slightly before his 47th birthday. Nothing about Hogg's career was normal. He started as a top 6 batter who bowled a little bit of medium pace when he wasn't delivering mail for a living. He ended up as the oldest player in professional cricket with a delivery that no one could handle. But the thing I keep thinking about is, it should be impossible to find one Shane Warne. Our sport has only had one, and here we are still talking about it. But to find a replacement like Stuart MacGill, who is a better leg spinner than most non-Asian teams I've ever had, is incredible. And then they had a third experienced international level wrist spinner who was still playing professional cricket at an age where most people are afraid to get out of bed too quickly because they might do their back in. And it's not the first time Australia have had overlap. Clary Grimmett and Bill O'Reilly certainly did that as well. But to think after their spin drought that Australia suddenly found 3 wrist spinners of this talent at the same time completely blows my mind. No matter how you think about it, it is one of the most incredible overlapping of talent that any team has ever had. And because Shane Warne existed, we barely talked about Stuart MacGill, and Brad Hogg was just a white ball specialist. And the truth is, no matter how good MacGill and Hogg were, with Warne around, it's hard for anyone to look that good. If you enjoyed this video, please comment or like. And if you want the next installment of In Shane Warne's Shadow, click the bell icon. In it, we look at some of the other bowlers from the same era, the first 2 replacements, and the men beset by almost every tragedy available.